All right, chapter 13, the hell. Oh no. At this time, that was a term generally used for like a seedy gambling establishment. Oh, I have a bad feeling. After having taken a few turns in Regent Street, the baronet observed that it was devilish slow work. Mr. Talbot suggested the propriety of a spree, and Mr. Chichester declared that as his friend Markham was anxious to see life, the best thing they could all do was to drop in for an hour at number, and it doesn't indicate which one, Quadrant. What place is that? Demanded Markham. Oh, only an establishment for cards and dice and other innocent diversions, carelessly answered Chichester. No, Richard! Run! The quadrant of an evening is crowded with loungers of both sexes. Beneath those arcades walk the daughters of crime by ones and twos, dressed in the flaunting garb that tells so forcibly the tale of broken hearts and blighted promise and crushed affections, to lose an hour amidst the haunts of pleasure and of vice, and to court the crime by which alone they live. The young men that saunter arm in arm up and down, and the hoary old sinners, they behold smiles upon the red lips and are far from suspecting that the hearts of those who laugh so joyfully are all but broken. Thus it is that in the evening the quadrant has a characteristic set of loungers of its own, or at least it is frequented after dusk by a population whose characters are easily to be defined. A bright lamp burnt in the fanlight over the door of number, again, they don't say which one. That was very common at the time of this, that this was written, because they didn't want to actually identify a specific place, so they would just leave it empty. Mr. Chichester gave a loud and commanding knock, and a policeman standing by, who doubtless had several golden reasons for not noticing anything connected with that establishment, instantly ran across the road after a small boy whom he suspected to be a thief, because the poor wretch wore an uncommonly shabby hat. The summons given by Mr. Chichester was not immediately answered. 5 minutes elapsed ere any attention was paid to it, and then the door was only opened to the small extent allowed by a chain inside. A somewhat repulsive-looking countenance was at the same time protruded from behind the door. "Well," said the man to whom the countenance belonged. "All right," returned Mr. Chichester. The chain was withdrawn, and the door was opened to its full extent. The party was thereupon admitted, with some manifestations of impatience on the part of the porter, who no doubt thought that the door was kept open too long, into a passage at the end of which was a staircase covered with a handsome carpet. Chichester led the way, and his companions followed, up to a suite of rooms on the first floor. These were well furnished and brilliantly lighted, and red moreen curtains with heavy and rich fringes were carefully drawn over the windows. Splendid mirrors stood above the mantels, which were also adorned with French timepieces in ormolu, and candelabra of the same material. On one side of the front room stood a buffet covered with wines and liquors of various descriptions. In the middle of that same front apartment was the rouge de noir table. On each side sat a croupier, with a long rake in his hand and a green shade over his eyes. Before one of them was placed a tin case. This was the bank. And on each side of that cynosure of all attention stood little piles of markers or counters. 2 or 3 men, well but flashily dressed and exhibiting a monstrous profusion of Birmingham jewelry about their persons, sat at the table. These were the bonnets, individuals in reality in the pay of the proprietor of the establishment, and whose duties consist in enticing strangers and visitors to play, or in maintaining an appearance of playing deeply when such strangers and visitors first enter the room. This is not a good place, Richard. The countenance of the croupiers were cold, passionless, and totally devoid of any animation. They called the game, raked up the winnings, or paid the losings, without changing a muscle of their features. For all that regarded animation or excitement, they might have been easily passed off as automatons. I didn't realize automatons was that old of a word. That's kind of cool. Automatons. Not so was it with the bonnets. These gentlemen were compelled to affect exuberant joy when they won and profound grief or rage when they lost. From time to time they paid a visit to the sideboard and helped themselves to wine or spirits, or regaled themselves with cigars. Well, these refreshments were supplied gratuitously to all corners by the proprietor. This apparent liberality was upon the principle of throwing out a sprat to catch a whale. When none save the croupiers and the bonnets were present, they throw aside their assumed characters and laugh and joke and chatter and smoke and drink. But the moment steps are heard upon the staircase, they all relapse with mechanical exactitude into their business aspect. The croupiers put on their imperturbable countenances as easily as if they were masks, and the bonnets appeared to be as intent upon the game as if its results were to them prospective life or death. The croupiers were usually trustworthy persons well known to the proprietor, or else shareholders themselves in the establishment. The bonnets are young men of education and manners who have probably lost the ample fortunes wherewith they commenced life in the very whirlpool to which, for a weekly stipend, they are employed to entice others. In one of the inner rooms there was a roulette table, but this was seldom used. A young lad held the almost sinister office of attending upon it. The front room was tolerably crowded on the evening when Chichester, Markham, the baronet, and Talbot honored the establishment with a visit. The moment they entered the apartment, Richard instinctively drew back, and catching hold of Chichester's arm, whispered to him in a hurried and anxious manner, "Tell me, is this a gambling house? Is it what I have heard called a hell?" "It is a gambling house, if you will, my dear fellow," was the reply, "but a most respectable one. Besides, you must see life, you know." I'm worried about Richard. With these words, he took Markham's arm and conducted him up to the rouge et noir table. A young officer, whose age could not have exceeded 20, was seated at the further end of the green base-covered board. A huge pile of notes and gold lay before him, but at rapid intervals one of the croupiers raked away the stakes which he deposited, and thus his heap of money was gradually growing smaller. "Well, this is extraordinary," said the young officer. "I never saw the luck set so completely against me. However, I can afford to lose a little, for I broke your bank for you last night, my boys." "What does that mean?" demanded Richard in a whisper. "He won all the money which the proprietor deposited in that tin case, he means," replied Chichester. "And how much do you suppose that might be?" "About 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. "Here, waiter," exclaimed the young officer, who had just lost another stake, "a glass of claret." The waiter handed him a glass of wine, so demanded. The young officer did not notice him for a moment, but waited to see the result of the next chance. He lost again. He turned round to seize the glass of wine, but when his eyes caught sight of it, his countenance became almost livid with rage. "Fool, idiot," he said, starting from his seat, "bring me a tumbler, a large tumbler full of claret. My mouth is parched and my stomach is like a lime kiln." The waiter hastened to comply with the wishes of the young gambler. The tumbler of claret was supplied and the game continued. Still the officer lost. "A cigar," he shouted in a fearful state of excitement. "Bring me a cigar." The waiter handed him a box of choice Havanas that he might make his selection. "Why the devil don't you bring a light at the same time, you infernal rascal?" cried the gamester, and while the domestic hastened to supply this demand also, he poured a volley of most horrible oaths at the bewildered wretch's head. This is not a super respectable establishment, Richard. Are you noticing? Are you paying attention? Again the play proceeded, and again the young officer lost. His pile of gold was gone. The croupier who kept the bank changed one of his remaining notes. "That makes 3,000 that I have lost already," said the young officer. "Including the amount you won last night, I believe," said the bonnets. "Well, sir, and suppose it is. What the deuce is that to you?" demanded the officer fiercely. "Have I not been here night after night for those 6 weeks, and have I not lost thousands? Thousands? When did I ever get a vein of good luck until last night? But never mind, I'll play on. I'll play till the end. I will either win all back or lose everything together, and then, in the latter case—" He stopped. He had just lost again. His countenance grew ghastly pale, and he bit his lips convulsively. "Claret, more claret," he exclaimed, throwing away the Havana. "That cigar only makes me the more thirsty." And again the play proceeded. "I am really afraid to contemplate that young man's countenance," whispered Markham to Chichester. "Who so?" "I have an idea that if he should prove unsuccessful, he will commit suicide. I have a great mind just to mention my fears to those men in the green shades who seem to be winning all his money." "Pray be quiet, they will only laugh at you." "But the life of a fellow creature? What do they care?" "Do you mean to say they are such wretches?" "I mean that they do not care one fig what may happen so long as they get the money." Markham was struck speechless with horror as he heard this cold-blooded announcement. Chichester had, however, stated nothing but the truth. "Richard!" The proceedings were now fearfully interesting. The young officer was worked up to a most horrible state of excitement. His losses continued to be unvaried by a single gleam of good fortune. Still he persisted in his ruinous career. Note after note was changed. At length his last was melted into gold. He now became absolutely desperate. His countenance was appalling. The frenzy of gambling and the inflammatory effects of the liquors he had been drinking rendered his really handsome features positively hideous. Markham had never beheld such a scene before and felt afraid. His companions surveyed it with remarkable coolness. The play proceeded, and in a few moments the officer's last stake was swept away. Then the croupiers paused, as it were, by common consent, and all eyes were directed toward the object of universal interest. "Well, I said I would play until I won all or lost all," he said, "and I have done so. Waiter, give me another tumbler of claret. It will compose me." He laughed bitterly as he uttered these words. The claret was brought. He drained the tumbler and threw it upon the table, where it broke into a dozen pieces. "Clear this away, Thomas," said one of the croupiers, completely unmoved. "Yes, sir," and the fragments of the tumbler disappeared forthwith. The bonnets, perceiving the presence of other strangers, were now compelled to withdraw their attention from the ruined gambler and commence playing. And so the play again proceeded. "Where is my hat, waiter?" demanded the young officer, after a pause during which he had gazed vacantly upon the game. "In the passage, sir, I believe." "No, I remember it is in the inner room, but do not trouble yourself, I will fetch it myself." "Very good, sir," said the waiter, and did not move. The young officer sauntered in a seemingly leisurely manner into the innermost room of the suite. "What a shocking scene," whispered Markham to Chichester. "I am glad I came hither this once. It will be a lesson for me which I can never forget." At this instant the report of a pistol echoed sharply through the rooms. There was a simultaneous rush to the inner apartment. Markham's presentiments were fulfilled. The young officer had committed suicide. His brains were literally blown away, and he lay upon the carpet weltering in his blood. A cry of horror burst from the strangers present, and then with one accord they hastened to the door. The baronet, Chichester, and Talbot were amongst the foremost who had made this movement, and were thereby enabled to effect their escape. Markham stood riveted to the spot, unaware that his companions had left him, and contemplating with feelings of supreme horror the appalling spectacle before him. Suddenly the cry of "The police!" fell upon his ears, and heavy steps were heard hurrying up the staircase. "The bank!" said one of the croupiers. "All right!" cried the other, and in a moment the lights were extinguished, as by magic, throughout the entire suite of rooms. Obeying a natural impulse, Markham hastened towards the door, but his progress was stopped by a powerful hand, and in an instant the bull's-eye of a lantern glared upon his countenance. He was in the grasp of a police officer. "Richard!" I feel like I need to make myself a t-shirt that just says, "Guys, I'm worried about Richard." I feel like that's all I say while I read these. No! Oh, Richard. Okay, we'll see what happens tomorrow.